This DLC had so much potential. Before I give my opinion on Shadows of Rose, I guess I should talk about some of the positive aspects of the Winter's expansion. Capcom finally implemented an official third-person perspective mode. Oh yeah, we also got the Mercenaries Additional Orders, which gave us a few extra characters to play in the Mercenary mode. I mean, most Resident Evil games in the past gave us multiple characters to play as at launch, but I guess it's better late than never. And we finally got our hands on Re:Verse, which is a game that exists.
He's already dead!
All these things are fine additions to the game, but the big meaty part of the DLC we were all after was of course the Shadows of Rose story expansion. The final cutscene of Village left a lot to be answered. Was Rose destined to be the protagonist of the next game? Is Miranda actually dead? What happened to Duke? How's Chris doing? Did he manage to convince Leon to bang his sister? The trailers for the DLC were intriguing to say the least, giving us a brand new story with Rose in the forefront as she tries to uncover the mysteries of her past and her powers. I think what intrigued people the most was seeing Duke as the villain. From how Capcom showed off the expansion, it seemed as though it would aim to answer these questions left at the end of the base game. So, was this the case?
No.
Maybe after all the great DLCs we got for Biohazard, I was expecting too much from this expansion. I'm not saying I think Shadows of Rose is outright bad, but rather than feeling satisfied after beating it, I just thought to myself, is that it? Some of the DLC's features genuinely were a nice surprise, but for the most part I felt like I was playing a remixed version of Village. The DLC lacks depth, and it feels like Capcom quickly mashed random assets from Village together to make a more condensed and convoluted experience of a game we have already played. It's a combination of multiple issues in the gameplay, story, and content that just make this expansion so forgettable. By now it's pretty clear that I didn't like it all that much, so I'll try and talk about some positives before I talk about the other issues. We all know by now that Resident Evil games don't win awards for their narratives.
And the award for Best Narrative goes to
Resident Evil.
Like that's ever gonna happen.
But for the most part, they have been interesting enough to keep you engaged. I actually enjoyed Village's story a lot, as it made you feel like there was a lot at stake for both the world and Ethan personally. The ending of the game left us puzzled as to what would be next for the franchise, and after the announcement of Shadows of Rose, it seemed as though it would be the next step to progress the story forward. And if you've actually played the expansion, you'll know just how wrong we all were. Before I talk about that, the story does have some positive aspects, like Rose Winters herself. The story follows Rose in a difficult spot in her life. Being the daughter of Mr. Mold himself, Rose has inherited special powers that, although grant her unique abilities, she views them more as a curse. Given her family's connection to the events of Village and having a family friend in the one and only Boulder Puncher, her life has consisted of spending most of her time in laboratories performing tests in order to monitor her abilities. Of course, Rose just wants to live her life as a regular teenager, though drinking Monster and vaping doesn't sound much better than becoming Evelyn 2.0. When given a proposition by this totally not suspicious guy Kay to enter the Megamycete in order to retrieve a purifying crystal that will dampen her powers, she immediately accepts, and we follow her as she ventures through a twisted dreamlike realm, kind of like Psychonauts minus the Milkman. I was concerned as to how they would flesh Rose out, and to my surprise, they did a pretty good job with her. An element I enjoyed about Ethan in Village was how clueless and scared he was about everything happening around him, and Rose embodies this characteristic as well. It makes her feel like a real and relatable person. What was also great to see was her struggle in this strange environment. I know that sounds kind of mean and malicious, but I love seeing a character who's weak get stronger and stronger as the game progresses. Most of the protagonists of Resident Evil are almost always portrayed as being cool, so finding out that Rose, for the most part, is a loner really does break your heart, as she comes across as a selfless individual looking for belonging in the world. Another great dynamic was finally seeing Rose interact with her dad. Michael. Seriously though, if you thought that this magical Harry Potter writing was anyone but Ethan, then you've clearly been hit too many times by the Orb of Confusion. Seeing these two interact was really sweet and fulfilling, and not only that, we got to see Ethan's mouth finally in action. Looks like Ethan found out about dental care after Biohazard. This would have been a touching way to finish their story, but then you realise that this DLC is in fact a prequel. Seeing the exact same cutscene from the ending of Village play out at the end of this DLC was a complete letdown, and just left me completely puzzled as to why they decided this being a prequel would be better than having it take place after after the end of Village. I guess you could say that it adds context as to why we see Ethan walking towards the car during the final seconds of the cutscene, implying that he has returned to the physical world thanks to Rose's efforts. But if this is the case, then it kind of nullifies his sacrifice at the end of Village. That's not to say that I would hate seeing Ethan again, because I thought he was a decent character, but having the DLC be a prequel doesn't progress the story forward at all, and only really gives context to a mystery that didn't need to be resolved yet. This really hit home just how lazy Capcom are, which was also highlighted by how poorly it handled the returning characters. Duke hit the hardest. Seeing as how the game takes place in a spirit-like realm, they could have really pushed the boat out on how they portrayed Duke, and to be fair, his introduction was pretty strong. For someone so comical and kind in the main game, it was really polarizing to see him act so cruel and conniving. With the whole bizarre setting of this expansion, it's hard to tell if this is actually Duke, or just another one of Miranda's tricks.
Spoilers.
Given Duke's otherworldly powers, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to suggest that perhaps Duke can enter this same sort of spiritual realm, like how Ethan was living there for a while. What was especially disappointing was that we never got to see these two interact one more time, all for the sake of keeping Ethan's identity a secret. Capcom, please just stop trying to add plot twists into your games. You got lucky with Wesker's betrayal at the end of the first Resident Evil, but it's just been downhill from there. Whilst it was great to see him again, it ultimately ended up being pointless in the scheme of the story, as the confrontation between him and Rose is left unfinished, and we aren't shown why he is acting in this way. He felt more like a cameo, which sucked as he was one of the most interesting aspects of the base game. As well as getting to see this fallen hero return, we also saw the return of a couple of villains, but unfortunately, it's not the two we all wanted to see make a return. Yeah, that's right folks, I'm sorry, pull your pants back up. If it wasn't clear to you from the start, Kay wasn't actually out to help you. In fact, it wasn't the real Kay at all, but in fact, Mother Miranda. Throughout the game, Rose stumbles upon copies of herself that have died horrifically due to the many challenges and monsters put in front of them. It's unclear as to why all of these clones are here, but once Miranda reveals herself, she explains that all of these versions of Rose were created by her in an attempt to once again resurrect her daughter, Eva. Seriously, Miranda? Your kid's dead, just let it go. To me, it seemed pretty pointless to bring her back. Her story was wrapped up nicely at the end of Village, with the twist being that she was Mia all along, and Capcom attempting to catch the player off guard with the almost same sort of twist was just so predictable. The game would have benefited a lot more if Miranda didn't return at all, and instead the DLC focused on Duke as the main villain. Oh yeah, something else Shadows of Rose should have left out was Evelyn.
No one will care!
Not again.
Her role in 7 was executed pretty well to be fair, but seeing her make a return in Village and its DLC really showed me just how much I hate her. I know she's just a kid, and kids are supposed to be annoying, but she's so irritating that I don't find her scary or threatening at all. In this DLC, she's encountered during the final third of the game in Angie's haunted house, and all she does the entire time is throw insults at you, and it really does start to get old. Evelyn has always been presented as a tragic character in Resident Evil, feeling like she doesn't belong and wanting nothing more than to be part of a family, but it's difficult to feel sorry for someone as annoying as her. I didn't expect much from the story, and yet somehow I was still disappointed. Bar Rose and her interactions with her dad, I can't think of anything else that was interesting, which is crazy to say considering the endless possibilities this setting offered. And why does every child in this game have the same voice and face? It's really unsettling. Now I just made it pretty clear that I didn't really enjoy the narrative Shadows of Rose went with, but honestly the gameplay does have a lot more positives. It's always nice to see a varied range of gameplay mechanics in Resident Evil games, and Shadows of Rose does have elements of variety, thanks in part to its setting. The DLC carries on Village's mix of action and horror, however focuses a lot more on horror, to varying effect. The game starts very strongly, harbouring back to the slow exploration build-up found in Resident Evil 7. In fact, this DLC felt very similar to the early hours of Biohazard, as often you find yourself sneaking around and avoiding enemies rather than fighting them head-on. Rose also runs slower than Ethan and cannot block attacks, discouraging you from fighting multiple enemies at a time. This really showed how inexperienced Rose is at the very beginning, just like her father was all those years ago, and just like how Zoe helped him, he must now mentor his own daughter. During the Castle Dimitrescu segment of the game, the stealth worked really well. The enemies are tough and can quickly overwhelm you if you aren't careful. Although we have been here before, these new sets of challenges give it a different edge. Returning to Angie's house was also pretty traumatizing thanks to those creepy Mia mannequins. After completing some puzzles in the house, several mannequins come to life and hunt you down, moving closer to you every time they are out of sight, and so you are forced to keep your eyes on them whilst at the same time trying to navigate your way out of the maze-like halls. This, I imagine, was especially terrifying for anyone else that grew up with the Weeping Angels from Doctor Who. Combat also received some pretty significant changes. Like I said, Rose is pretty vulnerable in this game, deciding to hide or run from enemies rather than attack them. However, that doesn't mean she is completely defenseless. Her connection to the mold allows her to manipulate it in some ways, changing the environment and freezing enemies in place for short periods of time. Over the course of the game, glass containers can be found that improve your abilities, allowing you to freeze enemies for longer and use it more times, which was great at showing Rose's gradual progression to a badass. The most interesting part of Rose's power is being able to manipulate the environment. In Castle Dimitrescu, small roots have spread across the inside of the castle, blocking necessary paths for you to progress, by covering the floor and walls in deadly strawberry jam. But Rose's power can be used to kill these roots, allowing you to progress. As well as this, some roots hide items, and some roots in the late game can also be used to distract enemies. It was a great mechanic to introduce, but honestly I just wish we got more use out of it. Whilst some features were severely underused, others were used way too often. The Haunted House overstayed its welcome for me in terms of its gameplay mechanics. It started out strong with the initial mannequin segment, but as it went on and the game introduced yet another slug crawl stealth segment, I just lost interest. Some of the segments in the game just felt a bit gimmicky and had no real substance. I was also pretty disappointed how they handled Rose's powers. As the game progresses, you think to yourself that Rose will start to gain more and more abilities, but after Castle Dimitrescu, you don't gain any new abilities until you fight Miranda, but you are given that ability 5 minutes before the game finishes. I mean, we've seen Evelyn do so much with her powers, so it would have been cool to see Rose do something more creative than just freezing enemies. Everything about this expansion just felt too familiar. It recycled too much. We know that Capcom has been guilty of doing this in the past, so it just feels like they're repeating bad habits. Some may say that the overuse of past locations makes sense, as we are playing inside the mind of the Megamycete, which has dwelled in this village for hundreds of years. But surely we could have got some more locations, as we can clearly see Miranda and Ethan manipulate the environment. The amount of assets and locations reused was baffling, and it amazes me that it took so long for this DLC to come out. I guess most of the team moved on to Resident Evil 4, but honestly, I would have preferred a shorter DLC if it meant that we got a more original concept. I may be in the minority when I say this, but Shadows of Rose felt like nothing but filler. The arrogance of Capcom to sell this DLC and claim it's anything other than a remix of different areas, enemies and characters is just insulting. But hey, at least Re:Verse is free to play.